This is a demonstration of the Brainspace Discovery Investigations workflow. Before we jump into the workflow, I'd like to start at a high level by just talking about the different algorithms that we're surfacing through our visuals. What makes Brainspace special is the way we bring these things together and deeply integrate these visuals together to help you find really the signal in the noise. The first algorithm really that is how we generate our brain, the way it works is, and we'll use this search as an example and a way to talk about what's actually happening here. I'll search for minority investor, which is a somewhat generic term in the Enron data set. And when we expand on the concept, what it's doing is it's going into the brain, which is separate from the index. The brain is really a representation of these repeated patterns in the content that really end up surfacing these conceptual kind of relationships between terms and therefore tying documents together. So when I search for minority investor, I'm able to see things like non-recourse debt and off credit. Those are all things I'd expect to see. They're financial in nature. But immediately this term here, friend of Enron, jumps out at me as something novel and unique. So one of the things that we're doing when we're going through this process of building a brain is we're actually identifying phrases, these multi-word terms that really mean something. And we're also then understanding sort of these things happening in proximity to each other conceptually. So when I search for minority investor, I'm able to then serendipitously discover this friend of Enron term. And if I want to explore that, I can simply move the slider. The current position is a representation of the relatedness, essentially the conceptual distance between friend of Enron and minority investor. When I move the slider all the way over to the right, I'm now interacting with the unsupervised machine learning algorithm, and the human component is giving me the ability to sort of decide what's relevant to me. So when I let go there of the slider, it will return 51 results that contain friend of Enron. So now that we've talked a little bit about how things you being conceptually related can give us this ability to serendipitously discover things that we didn't know to look for. Now let's talk about how we can use the cluster wheel, which is a different way to organize documents, to understand context. The cluster wheel is very powerful in that it lets you see things from a very high level. So imagine stepping away from this, in this case 450,000 emails, and being able to sort of see things organized into these buckets or clusters. This represents the entire data set. All documents live at the center, and as we move out to the edge of the wheel, piles of documents, basically the documents become more and more like each other, and we're taking the average document of each cluster, the top 4 terms, to essentially give you the gist of what's in that cluster. So in this use case, we're going to take that very novel and unique term, friend of Enron, and we're going to establish that, first of all, it's being used in 2 completely different types of documents, because we can see that it's showing up. This little red band here shows me that I've got hits all the way around the wheel. So what does it mean on this side of the wheel? How is it being used in these documents? And that's basically what that tells me, is that these documents are very different than the ones on the opposite side. So we'll go ahead and add those, and let's just take a sampling and see what we find here. If we actually look at this, we can see somebody here is introduced by a mutual family friend of Enron. So that does not look like a relevant use of that term. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the other side of the wheel by removing that search, centering the wheel, going over to this side, and we'll add that as a search. And now let's go ahead and sample from this side of the wheel. We'll grab that first document. And we can clearly see here that we're onto something. Now this is the right neighborhood of context that we're looking at. So we can see total return swap, capital friend of Enron. That's definitely the right vein. So let's continue to move through these results, and we'll eventually come to this document that's particularly interesting, AIG fund. And if we read through this document, there's our friend of Enron. And the last sentence is really what's interesting. And this is talking about ENA would have a requirement that this investments be hedged through Raptor. So what is Raptor? In my understanding of Raptor, in a sort of a more generic sense, it's predatory birds, dinosaurs, things like that. But in the Enron data, it takes on a completely different meaning. So we're going to go ahead and take Raptor, and we're going to copy it into our concept search. And first, we're going to remove that cluster filter. We'll go back over to our search, plug in Raptor, and then expand on that concept. I'm going to pause here for just a second just to kind of highlight how some of these other things that are tied to Raptor are surfaced in the concept search. So we can see Gordon McKillop's a person tied to Raptor. We've got Raptor Structure, Swaps, Merlin Credit was the finance vehicle. And really, one of the things that's interesting about this is that it's able to show you those connections really in an unbiased way, right? It doesn't know that Merlin Credit is the finance vehicle that's tied to Raptor. It just happens to show up in the text enough times, and the pattern emerges that gives us this relatedness, this conceptual connection between these terms. So I want to know more about Raptor. I'm going to go ahead and make that required, and I'm going to focus on the story around Raptor. Who are the people involved? And that's where we can move over to another visualization that we have called communications analysis. This visualization is actually called a network graph. And the idea is that it really does give you an at-a-glance understanding of the communication patterns that exist in your data. And we flipped over from the people view to our domain view just to kind of simplify what we're looking at, kind of lower the noise a little bit, because we really want to focus on a certain type of communication and really communication between certain domains. So we can see that, no surprise here, Enron is kind of a standout domain. And that's because we can tell that because the size of the node is larger. Essentially, the size of the node represents the amount of inbound and outbound traffic. You can also see that it's connected to these other domains, but specifically the one that really interests me is this Vincent and Elkins VE Law domain. And I want to then click on the edge, which is the line between the nodes, and you can think of that as a conduit of communication, so the data or emails flowing back and forth between these domains that contain the term Raptor. So we'll go ahead and then search on that. And before I move into showing you the people view, I'd like to just touch on what is actually happening behind the scenes. So you do not need to have an extensive understanding of how to build Lucene queries. The visuals are essentially representing the components of the search that are being executed all dynamically as you interface or interact with these visual artifacts. But if you actually wanted to see the Lucene query, we do save that, and that's what's being submitted when you interact with the visuals to bring you back the results that you're seeing. So this is completely defensible and repeatable, and you can see how it's built. So now that we've got our 8 results, let's go ahead and flip over to our people view because we want to understand who are the main players or characters involved in communication about Raptor between Vincent and Elkins and Enron. And here we get a very clear overview of those individuals. And you can see that Sarah, there's Gordon McKillop, Mark Spradling, those are the key communicators. But we can also see this other communication happening over here on the side. And if I click on the edge between those two people, you can see that they're really just talking about what appears to be sporting events, right? There's Toronto Raptors, so it's a false positive. They just happen to fit the other search criteria and that they were at VE Law and Enron and talking about exchanging sporting event tickets. So very easy to find those types of things and see those when you're looking at things visually. Now, really, these beats that we walk through in the investigation workflow are negotiable depending on the types of investigations that you're moving through. The idea is that you take what you know, the little bit of information you have at the beginning of an investigation, and you plug those things into Brainspace and expand on that knowledge using the visuals, taking these different sort of looks at things or looking at the data through these different lenses, different perspectives. The visuals are all deeply integrated, so I'd like to just demonstrate one other alternative in this workflow. Let's say, for example, we wanted to understand how this topic of Raptor started with the data that we have. We can remove this filter, and then we can go ahead and back out to what we call our dashboard view. The dashboard gives us the ability to quickly filter on metadata and then see those results change on the other visuals. So we're going to use a couple of different things here. We're going to look at just unique documents. So we're going to focus on near duplicates and originals. So we're going to click on the orange and the purple portions of the data overview. And we can see that the timeline changes and updates accordingly. We can also adjust these, what we call facets, and these are all metadata driven, and they can be adjusted to your liking. We recommend that you keep metadata fields to a minimum, really to the ones that are ultimately going to help you in filtering what you're looking at and seeing the results in a sort of clearer view. But these things are very dynamic, and the idea is that you can adjust them and click on a metadata value and filter by that value. So it's essentially like plugging it into the search. But we're going to use the date information here. So we've got 8 results in July of 2000 that really are the representative of the sort of startings of this Raptor term or Raptor topic in the data that we have. And when we click on that, we can then flip back over to our communications analysis and we can see the people involved in communication about Raptor in the very early stages. So David Delaney is at the center of that. You can see here is our 8 results that represent sort of how it started. And if these were the things that represented our findings, we could go ahead and quickly click on Create a Collection and put in a name there or a description, and ultimately that can be synced over to a review database, or we can push it out to a set of list of IDs, or we can come back to it at a later time and use it as part of a search or a way to kind of find other things that are like what I've added to my collection. So we've already created one called Findings, and we can add these results to that collection. You also have options to add the rest of the family. And ultimately, that's your goal, right? You want to move through the noise, find the signal, find whatever evidence you need, and then stop at that point once you have enough. That concludes our investigations workflow using Brainspace Discovery 5. Thank you.